In his 1939 poem, Bertolt Brecht wrote that what are now famous lines, "In the dark times will there also be singing, yes, there will also be singing about the dark times." Written during his exile from Nazi Germany, Brecht was identifying a kind of resilience born out of calamity and hardship. In our own dark times, not only do music, art, and comedy supply us with possibilities for solidarity and succor, but so too do our scholarly conversations. They can be modes of illumination that cultivate our capacities for deep reflection, creative estrangement, and action. And it is in that spirit that on behalf of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, I'd like to welcome you to our special event with John Gans today. I'm Lisa Wedeen, the director of 3CT, and I'm deeply appreciative of our collaboration with Law, Letters, and Society. The director of Laws, Letters, and Society, LLSO for short, John McCormick, who is the Carl J. Weintraub Professor of Political Science in the college, will do the proper introduction of John Gans today. Professor McCormick will also moderate the Q&A. But before we get there, I'd just like to thank 3CT's fabulous staff. It's hard to express how indebted we are to 3CT's Associate Director, Anna Searle-Jones, whose help in organizing our gatherings and assistance in thinking imaginatively about programming, student affairs, and institution building are so essential to our collective. We're also indebted to Ryan Eckholt and our student assistant, Lucy De Silva, for their indispensable labor. Please give them a round of applause. And now, without further ado, I turn this event over to Professor John McCormick. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a delight to be introduced by one of my dearest friends and most important colleagues. I'd like to thank Morgan Lott of the Law, Letters, and Society program for her part in putting this terrific event together. It's a great delight to have John Gans to the University of Chicago campus. For those of you who are on Twitter, you may know John Gans. You may follow him as a source of sobriety and clarity in these maddening times. If you subscribe to his Substack newsletter, you will get at least once a week a treasure trove of cultural commentary, political analysis, and humor, which Lisa brought up, and it is very important as well in these times. He's also the author of this widely acclaimed and best-selling book, When the Clock Broke, that I'll say just a couple of words about in a minute. But I just want to put John and his work and his career in a certain perspective. John is, to my mind, the last of the great New York intellectuals. After World War II, New York was the home of a group of astounding intellectual productivity, great thinkers such as Lionel Trilling, Alfred Kazin, Diana Trilling, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt. Not all of these intellectuals were Jews, but the vast majority were. Not all of them were academics, but those who weren't academics, it's arguable to say, set the standard for intellectual brilliance and scholarly achievement. John Gans lives up to that legacy. John has brought to relevance the history of European authoritarianism. He makes relevant for our world today authoritarianism in France, particularly the continuity of anti-Semitism from the Dreyfus Affair to the Vichy regime. In Italy, the rise of Mussolini and fascism, and Gramsci's amazing critique of that development, and also the rise of Nazism in Central Europe, a historical development that affected John's family. I thank him for those interventions, and I think we're going to have something along those lines today. About when the clock broke, a kind of scary read, because John lays out the politics of the 1990s and shows how the origins of our contemporary authoritarian moment were formed in those years. The 1990s of Pat Buchanan, of David Duke, of Rudy Giuliani, and of course of Donald J. Trump. So without any further hesitation or delay, please give a warm welcome to John Gans.
Can you hear me? Okay, one second. I'm going to read off the computer. I hope you don't mind. But what I do is I write in the Substack thing to kind of trick myself that I'm not really writing. So this is what works for me. I just want to express my gratitude to the University of Chicago, the colleges of, sorry, hold on one second. Just pop up. The College of Letters, Law, and Society, and the Center for Contemporary Theory for inviting me here. I especially want to thank Professor McCormick for an extremely warm welcome. I'm going to ask you to bear with me a little if I'm a little awkward. I'm not totally afraid of public speaking. I did debate in high school, but I've never given a lecture like this. My main occupation is what polite people would call a journalist. I might have been called a pamphleteer in previous centuries. I've been called worse. And if you really want to hurt my feelings, you can call me a pundit. I've written a book, one book, but in general, my writings are desultory and occasional as I respond to events. I do try to keep a framework in mind, but to call it a theory would perhaps a little stretch, a little pretentious, but let's just say I have some ideas that I want to share with you. I also want to say what a great honor it is to be speaking here at this university where two of my intellectual heroes, Saul Bellow and Hannah Arendt, once taught. Yesterday, I learned from Professor McCormick that Arendt gave her human condition lectures in this very room, which I think adds a little bit to the pressure, but also to the honor of it. Bellow and Arendt's work in different ways illuminated their own dark century and ensured that the idea of humanity would not disappear into oblivion despite the overwhelming horrors of their age. Bellow was concerned with the obliteration of inner life, the destruction of spiritual solitude, and the need for contemplation in the face of the endless distractions of modern consumer society. Arendt was concerned with the loss of civic space and the disappearance of a world of shared public meaning. As such, I think they both have much to tell us today. Being about politics, this talk will include much more Arendt than Bellow, but it seems worth noting that both their life's work was conditioned by an attempt to understand the catastrophes that followed from the rise of fascism. Bellow's first published short story, written when he was still a young Trotskyist, an undergrad at Northwestern University, not far from here, in the 1930s, was a rejoinder or an addendum of sorts to Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here, entitled The Hell It Can't. It's a grim little tale where a young man is pulled out of his home by faceless jackbooted thugs and beaten for refusing to enlist in the military of some totalitarian America in the near future. It concludes with the line, "He was 5 blocks from home," which take on some added poignancy today, as just blocks from here, the city of Chicago witnessed its people pulled from their homes by masked and uniformed agents of the state. As it happens, the title, The Hell It Can't, was itself taken from the dialogue of Lewis's novel. The novel's protagonist, an extraordinarily clear-sighted and ironical journalist, Doremus Jessup, who saw the potential of a fascist America early, no comparison intended, I assure you, is talking to the leading citizens of the small town of Vermont where he edits a newspaper. One of the town's chief businessmen says, "That couldn't happen here in America, not possibly. We're a country of free men. It might be a good thing to have a strong man in the saddle, but it just can't happen here in America." And Jessup replies, "The hell it can't." Well, let's see. 50 years ago, in an address on the occasion of the country's bicentennial, Hannah Arendt said, "The past haunts us. It is the past function to haunt us, who are present and wish to live in the world as it really is, that is, has become what it is now." So to describe the world as it really is and to understand what it has become, I'm going to briefly narrate the recent past and try to bring us to the present. Then I will turn to the more distant past to see what lessons it holds. In the past decade, a charismatic outsider of the political system offered himself as a providential solution to a national crisis brought on by decadence, failed wars, and economic debacles. He described himself as the only one who could fix it, offering a program of restored national greatness, a national rebirth to salve a wounded and humiliated national pride. He directed a stream of angry and dehumanizing rhetoric against both corrupt cosmopolitan elites and hated racial minorities responsible for the decline. The mob of the extreme right and all the charlatans from the conspiracist demi-monde flocked to him as the long-hoped messenger for their kind of politics. He menaced and then ultimately co-opted the existing conservative elite who believed they could ride his movement to get their policy agenda through, and then increasingly turned to him out of fear of a marauding left wing. He attacked the press as the enemies of the people, merely the lying organ of the existing political establishment. He employed reality-defying propaganda and mass rallies. He promised to employ a kind of TV technocracy, a government of the smartest, which is also a populist alternative to the failed elites. He provided a menu of vague, contradictory, and competing policy ideas that included nods to social redistribution, but ultimately catered to the needs of big business. A cult of personality formed around him with messianic and millenarian fantasies. Right-wing intellectuals, returning to the reactionary arcana of years gone by, began to fantasize about a new order and proposed the leader as an emergency custodial dictator, a red Caesar that could put the country back on track and save it from the radical left. When this leader lost the democratic election, he instructed a mob that included far-right paramilitary formations to attack the national legislature and attempted putsch against the constitutional order. Because, according to the leader and his followers, no possible abrogation of his providential power could be legitimate. It is always intrinsically fraudulent, part of the web of deceit spawned by the corrupt globalist elites. This is just the first term, by the way. Now the leader has returned to power through fair electoral means after failed attempts to use the legal system to bring him to account, and the collapse of the old order's last stand around a pitifully aged statesman. He formed a new and more powerful coalition that brought together a reactionary faction of major industrialists who had grown fearful of their own workers, a frustrated Mittelstand of regional businesses long disadvantaged by international trade, and a rural and exurban petty bourgeoisie resentful of the urban centers. He also expanded the coalition with a catch-all, populist, anti-system appeal that captured disillusioned constituents of the old parties. To déclassé young men of doubtful prospects, his propaganda promises a return to the glory days of traditional families, in other words, a return to masculine domination. To his disciples, he promised a regime of vengeance, and he's beginning to deliver. In foreign policy, he puts aside the failing and hypocritical system of international compacts and agreements in favor of a worldview of crude national self-aggrandizement and rapine. He strives to replace the veiled imperialism of financial hegemony with the naked imperialism of resource plunder. The regime radically alters the Constitution by fiat to change the settled legal understanding of citizenship that has prevailed for almost 200 years. He has begun the process of using the criminal justice system against his enemies. He's begun a purge of the bureaucracies and security service of politically unreliable elements. He greatly expands the section of the security apparatus most ideologically sympathetic to his cause. His regime and movement have become a world unto themselves, encased in an alternate reality built of vulgar propaganda and lurid fantasy. The regime seeks to ideologically coronate the profession of law and the university system. He has also begun the process of mass expulsion of migrants to bring out the racial purification of the homeland. He attempts to bring critics and the media to heel with the help of friendly oligarchs. The leader's chief propagandist and ideologue labels the major domestic opposition a criminal and terrorist organization and calls for legitimate force to be used against it. The hysterical tribunes of the ruling party call for civil war and direct mobs to harass anyone who is not sufficiently pious about the martyred dead. Through a series of decrees, the leader has directed the national security apparatus against domestic opposition, organized what the regime calls the anti-fascist lie. There are constant invocations of emergency powers to deal with supposedly existential foes that in fact are often little more than phantoms drawn from the fevered imagination or ideological caricature. The Secretary of Defense calls for the staff of a professional army to turn away from its traditions and turn itself into an undisciplined and murderous band of warriors. The leader rails against the enemy within and demands the use of troops in American cities in front of the military high command. And he has now called the federalized militia to essentially invade other states, stretching the Union and Constitution to its limits. This very day, he called for the governor of this state to be jailed for opposing that abuse of power. And while his most radical supporters call for ever more drastic action, an end to normal constitutional order, the destruction of the enemy. And who is this enemy? As the self-proclaimed sovereign representative of the real American people, he decides. Now, I'm sure I must be missing something, but events are moving very quickly. These, I believe, are the relevant facts of the matter. I presented them in a way that is stylized, but I think not tendentious. Every single one of them has its basis in a statement or action of Trump or his chief supporters. Whatever one thinks of the causes and origins of these facts, who is properly to blame for them, I think it's a matter of growing consensus that we are in the midst of this nation's greatest crisis of this nation's governing institutions in 160 years. Still, there are some that think talk of fascism is rash and inappropriate. My opponents in the debate over the fascism question that has taken place over the past decade first insisted that the notion was too specific and limited in scope. The term, they said, could only truly apply to the special and extremely dire and violent conditions that obtained in interwar Europe. Then they said the term was too broad. In contemporary discourse, fascism has come to be little more than an insult, an emotional outburst with no real content. Then they said that one should not speak of fascism if one wasn't ready to take up arms or flee, as if blind rage or terror were the only political options. In this opinion, they are ignominiously joined by the representatives of this regime, who, I think I can say without being overly dramatic, would paint this very speech, the mere utterance of the word fascism, as tantamount to terrorism and incitement to violence. In better faith, I think some have said that authoritarianism is evident, but that the word fascism was perhaps going too far. They would point to other paradigms like hybrid regimes or competitive authoritarianism, and contemporary examples like Turkey, Russia, Hungary, or India. Others would point to America's own history and question whether or not we need to import a foreign concept when we have our own history of brutal repression reaction, citing slavery, the Confederacy, the end of Reconstruction, the Klan, the two Red Scares and McCarthyism, and the George Wallace movement. I don't deny that all of those cases are instructive, and we have much to learn from their study. I don't offer my views as a replacement or in competition with those, but as a supplement. Some say, as a piece of rhetoric, fascism is too severe, too dire, that it will plunge people into despair, that it gives the enemy strength by exaggerating his frightfulness and gives him an air of historical grandeur and tragedy, what is better characterized as clownishness. I sympathize partly with this argument. Fear is a useful force multiplier for a regime that has limited numbers and capacities in a vast and complicated country. I don't want to demoralize or frighten, far from it. I would say that it's important to separate the image of fascism created by its own propaganda as some unstoppable juggernaut from the reality, which is of a dangerous and risky form of politics, which has to walk a tightrope and make increasingly desperate leaps and gambles. And then finally, there's an argument that says if you can speak freely about fascism, as I'm doing here, it's not fascism. This seems to me patently absurd, as if there were no such thing as time and space, as if the world were just a succession of different abstract ideas that negate each other. I was just talking to Dylan Riley, a sociologist at UC Berkeley the other week, and I think he had a very helpful way to understand this. Usually scholars talk about the distinction between a fascist regime and a fascist movement. Riley proposed a tripartite model. We appear to have a fascist government, the beginnings of a fascist state, but not a totally fascisticized society. The combination of all three you could call a consolidated fascist regime. I also want to briefly address the question of rhetoric. Rhetoric gets a bad rap. In contemporary usage, it usually means something that's intrinsically dishonest or emotionally manipulative. But in the classical tradition, rhetoric is simply part of reasoning and deliberation. Public affairs and political events do not deal with logical certainties. The course of historical reality is much too complex and unpredictable for that. And I'm sorry if there are positivist social scientists in the House, but there is no geometric method for politics. The art of rhetoric deals with the plausible and the probable. To persuade others of what is probable to occur under a given set of circumstances, rhetoric presents precedents, which is to say analogies. There is no avoiding it. We have to look to past experience to understand the present, even if we know that things are and will be different in ways we cannot possibly imagine in advance. To me, this analogy seems not just persuasive, but insistent and unavoidable. By almost any definition, any scholarly attempt to draw out the abstract shape of fascist history, we can see its shadow cast across the present. One of the most famous, simple, and I would say elegant formulations of the fascist minimum is from the historian Roger Griffin. He writes, "Fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core and its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism." Palingenetic means pertaining to rebirth, to regeneration, so make America great again. I also want to highlight Griffin's use here of the word genus, that is to say, a broader, more capacious category than species. This may be a different species, which evolved under different conditions, but it bears a family resemblance. I can't think of what better characterizes the Silicon Valley wing of MAGA's simultaneous fetish for rapid technological advance and desire for aggressive social order and authoritarian mode of government, for its belief that technical progress can only be recommenced after a progress of racial and gender purification, its combination of nostalgic kitsch and digital reproduction, than the historian Jeffrey Herf's concept of reactionary modernism. And how should we understand the crystallizing conditions of chaos, the endemic corruption, racketeering, and cronyism, the paradoxical decline of state functionality and cohesion, just as its repressive organs are being flexed, than through Franz Neumann's classic Behemoth, where he describes an irrational, chaotic, lawless, anarchic condition of domination, without a coherent political theory, a non-state that forcibly kept the economy going for the power accumulation of the leader and the profit of the large industrial capitalists. Even the hoary, simplistic formulas of the Third International seem today to have something to them. Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. And more personally, I find it hard sometimes not to feel the same as Thomas Mann, who wrote in his diary in 1933 that he had just witnessed a revolution without underlying ideas, against everything nobler, better, decent, against freedom, truth, and justice. But setting aside the understandably high emotions of the day for a moment, I want to try to provide some deeper analysis of the present. I'm going to talk about some general structural features and then move to some more specific discussions without, I hope, delving into rank punditry. Hold on a moment. The analysis of fascism's rise that I find most persuasive and most applicable and helpful to understand the present predicament comes from Antonio Gramsci. He knew whereof he spoke because he wrote about it while languishing in a fascist prison. Gramsci situated in the rise of fascism what he called a crisis of authority, in his own favorite terminology, an organic crisis or crisis of hegemony. These are periods when, I quote, "the great masses have become detached from their traditional ideologies and no longer believe what they used to believe previously. And the traditional parties in that particular organizational form, with the particular men who constitute, represent, and lead them, are no longer represented by their class or fraction of their class as its expression. These are situations of conflict between represented and representatives that reverberate out from the parties throughout the terrain of the state and civil society." Gramsci famously remarked that in this interregnum, the The old is dying, and the new cannot be born. A great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Such an interregnum, he believed, would also provide an opening for violent solutions for the activities of unknown forces represented by charismatic men of authority. Gramsci also calls this a general crisis of the state. I believe what we are witnessing and have witnessed in the last decade is such a crisis of hegemony. Dylan Riley, I think, has an ingenious interpretation and elaboration of Gramsci's concepts. He proposes that the crisis of hegemony is when there are no political institutions, traditional parties, parliaments, and the like, that can provide hegemonic national leadership or appear legitimate to the broad masses. Instead, there is a strong democratic demand bubbling up, as it were, from an overdeveloped civil society. Now, I think we've all read or heard about the weakening of civil society, of the crisis of loneliness, of atomization. We've heard of Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, of course. But I think that the whole literature on civil society and social capital did not, and perhaps could not grasp, is, in a word, the internet. Riley writes that rather than being connected to a specific stage of economic development or a specific state form, fascism must be understood as the result of a political crisis rooted in the combined and uneven development of civil society and hegemony. I think we're witnessing is precisely this uneven and combined development. We have undergone a massive acceleration and proliferation in new forms of social relations and new forms of identity formations, and they are breaking through the integument of 18th, 19th, and 20th century institutions. Practices that, taken together, make up what we called liberal democracy. To further quote Riley, fascist movements are perfectly situated to exploit the crisis of political representation caused by a situation of civil society overdevelopment in relation to hegemony. Fascism, a political project aiming to establish a new relationship with the nation and the state, can be expected to emerge where social elites fail to develop a hegemonic political organization in the context of rapid civil society development. The fascist political project arises as an attempt to address the problem of hegemonic weakness by creating an authoritarian democracy, a regime that claims to represent the people or nation but rejects parliamentary institutional forms. Gramsci identified this phenomenon as reactionary Caesarism, which, if we want to talk about genus rather than species, might not be a bad name for what we are watching now. This is also precisely what the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, from a very different point of view, was talking about in the crisis of parliamentary democracy, when he wrote of a type of democracy that would do away with the plurality of interests and create a homogeneous polity through the will of a plebiscitary leader who would, of course, repress the heterogeneous elements. That's all you guys, by the way. This is precisely the kind of regime they're trying to establish here. They openly admit it. Every Trump-aligned figure with any intellectual pretensions constantly invokes Schmitt. I also want to talk for a moment about the young liberal intellectual Piero Gobetti, also a tragic martyr of fascist thugs, who came to a similar conclusion as his friend Gramsci. Italian liberalism was not democratic enough in his view. It was calcified and moribund, which had created the conditions for the pseudo-democratic revolution of the fascists. The solution was to radicalize and deepen the democratic commitment of liberals. Envisioning a kind of agonistic, conflictual democracy, he believed that Italian liberals should embrace the labor movement as an emancipatory project and provide their intellectual firepower to any other emancipatory social movement that came along. His project was still more elitist than Gramsci's, who wanted to foster a new intellectual ruling class. Gobetti wanted to foster a new intellectual ruling class, while Gramsci looked to organic intellectuals that would rise out of the working class and be permanent persuaders. The fact of the matter is, then as now, the right wing got there first, so to speak, in this general crisis of hegemony, and they were able to more organically embed themselves, or force themselves, as the case may be, in the new forms of civil society, media, and association. And of course, they got more than a little help from their friends in Silicon Valley. When liberals bemoan the lack of a liberal Joe Rogan, I think they're basically saying we have no organic intellectuals. We can also see the crisis of hegemony playing out dramatically in the Democratic Party as well. Gramsci talked about the key issue in fending off a reactionary Caesarism being the party's capacity to react against force of habit, against the tendency to become mummified and anachronistic. Mummified. Do I really even need to say it? You might object that the Trump movement, which has never gotten an absolute majority of the vote and first came to power with an electoral college win, is not really representative of Democratic demand. But it certainly is within the parameters of the Republican Party. He won his primary in 2016 quite overwhelmingly. I believe the lack of internal democracy in the Democratic Party and the strong resistance of its old leadership to it is a central part of why they do not appear legitimate or appealing in the eyes of the broader electorate. We can pine for the age of the smoke-filled room and the role of the strong party, but it's not coming back. The people expect something else. The party needs an infusion of actual enthusiasm. The old saw goes that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. I think that's become reversed. The Democrats are hidebound and stuck in a paradigm of politics, and it's hurting them more than Trump's attacks. Just look at how slowly they've responded to the clear shift in public opinion on Israel and Palestine. I want to address one more criticism. A lot of left-wing critics of the fascism thesis object that there is no genuine revolutionary threat to create a reactionary counter-revolution. Well, first of all, there is in the minds of right-wingers. And second, there kind of was. What do they think the George Floyd protests were, or what is called cancel culture or wokeness that so preoccupies traditional elites? And what about the growth of worker power and quits during the period of pandemic and inflation? There was something like a preventative counter-revolution, a term from Marcuse that was further developed in the black radical tradition. How else to explain how Thiel's once eccentric brand of reactionary modernism suddenly became very persuasive to many other members of his class? I believe it is the haute tech bourgeoisie's reaction to the same crisis of hegemony produced by technological development. Very simply put, here's what I think happened. In the process of accumulating enormous wealth, the tech oligarchs created the conditions for their loss of social power, and when they realized this, they got a big dose of class consciousness and turned furiously reactionary. The process is analogous to what Marx thought was taking place in the industrial capitalist economy, but transposed into the digital realm. To accumulate wealth, the bourgeoisie needed factories, and the factories needed workers, but the need for workers and their exploitation created a mass militant proletariat. In 2016, you have Bernie Sanders forging a coalition between this new, precarious, but radicalizing section of a progressive petty bourgeoisie, the professional managerial workers, and the remnants of an old, beaten-down industrial working class, and it almost worked. Just as in the case of industrial capitalism, the internet has also facilitated the creation of reactionary mobs, an alienated, atomized, declassed heap, the refuse of all classes, as Marx once wrote, lumpen and viewing social advances and the progressive bourgeoisie as the reason for its downward mobility and loss of social status. In 2016, the tribune of the reactionary mob and petty bourgeoisie won the election against the fracturing liberal coalition. This started a furious counter-push, not necessarily coherent and united, in fact with significant and debilitating internal contradictions among the progressive bloc and its activists. The great demonstrations of early Trumpism, Me Too, wokeness, the new wave of labor activism, the shifting nature of gender relations, and ultimately the big one, the George Floyd protests, were all different articulations of this progressive counter-thrust. After 2016 showed the reactionary potentials of the internet, the Democratic Party started to get more interested in reigning and controlling the power of Silicon Valley, which the tech industrialists viewed as a terrible betrayal, but was actually a concession to the shifting class composition of their coalition. As all this unfolded, mostly on the platforms the tech capitalists created, with the help of the sympathetic liberal bureaucracy that staffed the platforms and regulated them for the federal government, a section of the tech lords recoiled in horror and quickly went from being a friendly, idealistic liberal bourgeoisie, paying lip service to progressive ideas, to a reactionary oligarchy, intent on reasserting control. Where they had once been cosmopolitan, suddenly they rediscovered the virtues of nationalism. Where they had once built social media platforms, now had empowered and even created their antagonists, suddenly social media was weak and consumerist. They were turned to heavy industry and military tech. Elon Musk looks longingly at the authoritarian techniques of Chinese tech capitalists who brutally work their engineers from morning to night. So they allied with the online mob, their bastard offspring. They'd sack their politically unreliable managerial layer, and they'd work furiously on the development of their Manhattan Project, an atomic bomb to drop on the professional managerial class to replace it permanently with AI. They'd also pump up their bribe system for their lumpen allies, cryptocurrency. They've taken their model from the C-suite to Capitol Hill and are trying to do the Twitter to X model in the federal government. If this sounds far-fetched to you, you can just listen to venture capitalist Mark Andreessen. I'm basically paraphrasing what he said. He openly admitted all this to Ross Douthat. He described what was going on in the tech companies as revolution, where the professional tech workers were capturing the companies. And then you add to this inflation and the approach to full employment, where you have massive quit rate in the workforce and rapidly rising wages, which prove to be a double-edged sword. In his political aspects of full employment, the Polish economist Michał Koleski surmised that even the prospect of increased profits would not reconcile the bosses to full employment. He wrote, "The maintenance of full employment would cause social and political changes that would give a new impetus to the opposition of the business leaders. Indeed, under a regime of permanent full employment, the SAC would cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure, and the social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the working class would grow. Strikes for wage increases, improvements in conditions of work would create political tension. The social position of the boss being undermined is a huge complaint you hear all across the Silicon Valley tech chiefs. They were losing their ability to discipline and control their workers." By the way, what Koleski said would reconcile bosses to full employment was fascism. I think we'll see about that. I have a feeling we're about to have a lot of unemployment. As I mentioned, inflation may have been part of the story of increased worker power, but it also created serious cost of living hardships. I think the most underrated reason for the mass dissatisfaction in the population that led to the re-election of Trump was the period of abortive social democracy during and after the pandemic. You have all these wonderful social programs that alleviate hardship, people start to feel prosperous for the first time, and then bam, many are canceled just as inflation takes hold. They're canceled out of fear of inflation, so you get the worst of both worlds. Before I finish, I want to address a category I used a couple times earlier, which is the mob. This sounds both very old-fashioned and more of an insult than a sociological interpretation, but I think it's very useful, and not just as an insult. Hannah Arendt famously called German fascism the temporary alliance of the mob and the elite, which I think is apt. The mob is another phenomenon of this general crisis of civil society and hegemony. The mob is not a class in the usual sense. It can include both rich and poor. Marx called it the scum, offal, refuse of all classes. And Arendt described it as the déclassé of all classes. What unites them is a shared sense of exclusion from society and a resentment towards it. Arendt writes, "The mob is primarily a group in which the residue of all classes are represented. This makes it so easy to mistake the mob for the people, which also comprises all strata of society. While the people in all great revolutions fight for true representation, the mob will always shout for the strong man, the great leader. For the mob hates society from which it is excluded, as well as parliament where it is not represented. Plebiscites, therefore, with which modern mob leaders have obtained such excellent results, are an old concept of politicians who rely upon the mob. The mob's natural mode of activism is anti-political and conspiratorial." I quote again, excluded as it is from society and political representation, the mob turns of necessity to extra parliamentary action. Moreover, it is inclined to seek the real forces of political life and those movements and influences which are hidden from view and work behind the scenes. Hegel, in The Philosophy of Right, distinguishes the modern subject into two roles: the bourgeois, self-interested participant in civil society, and the citizen, integrated into the social whole with a sense of public duty. Civil society's voluntary organization, what Hegel calls the corporation, mediate this split by channeling individual egoism into collective and cooperative action. Membership provides socially recognized roles and fosters solidarity and mutuality, even among competitors. Without these mediating institutions, or with their rapid replacement by new and ungovernable versions, the integration of the bourgeois into a civic whole breaks down. When this integration fails, Hegel believes that civil society produces the rabble. This is not simply poverty, but a psychological state. Individuals feel alienated, resentful, and indignant. Hegel writes that poverty in itself does not make man into a rabble. A rabble is created only when there is joined to poverty a disposition of mind, an inner indignation against the rich, against society, and against the government. But this poverty is always relative to the minimum attainable in a given society. In modern society, social media and the constant visibility of others' consumptions make the production of such a mob endemic. Envy becomes ubiquitous, and more people experience the rabble disposition at least intermittently. Hegel also identifies a rich rabble, those who accumulate wealth and power but see themselves as absolute and detached from the mediating institutions of the state and the corporation. They mistake public envy of their conspicuous success for recognition. As Frank Ruda describes in his book Hegel's Rabble, the rich rabble is marked by the corruptness which manifests in the fact that the rabble takes everything for granted itself because he denies the right to any of the legal, ethical, or state institutions. It assumes an economically determined state of nature in which it can also assume the economic right of the fittest. Donald Trump, in my view, is a virtually perfect example of this rich rabble. He treats wealth, visibility, and power as ends in themselves, divorced from honor or from ethical or civic constraints. Like Marx's caricature of Louis Napoleon, he is the chief of the lumpen proletariat, who here alone rediscovers in mass form the interests which he personally pursues. An old crafty roue, he conceives the historical life of the nations and their performances of state as comedy in the most vulgar sense, as masquerade in which the grand costumes, words, and postures merely serve to mask the pettiest knavery. The mob mentality, rich or poor, turns to naturalization and reification. Inequality, domination, hierarchy are understood as inevitable, natural conditions. Ideologies that legitimate this, social Darwinism, racism, misogyny, myths of eternal tribal warfare, are all endemic to mob thinking. Unlike a revolutionary proletariat, the mob does not pursue universal justice or systemic change. It seeks affirmation of grievances, symbolic victories, and personal or collective retribution. It is manipulable, reactive, and motivated more by spectacle than reason. Social media accelerates its formation, exposing people to constant comparison, envy, and outrage. The mob is a product of capitalist society. Wealth and accumulation and commercial expansion create relative deprivation, exclusion, and envy. But there is a degree to which the mob is just capitalist society itself. Arendt notes that it embodies the bourgeois ethos, relentless pursuit of self-interest and accumulation, just stripped of bourgeois liberalism's moral niceties. Fascism is perhaps not so much the alliance of the mob and the elite, but the recognition and arrival of their fundamental identity. So I realize this all has been a little grim. Often, if I'm speaking in public, I get asked where there's hope, and I'm always tempted to respond that that's not my department. But I guess the best I can offer you at the moment is an old chestnut from John Dewey, that the cures for the ills of democracy is more democracy. I think that's broadly true, especially if your institution bears the name democratic. But we are not just a democracy, but a republic, a democratic republic. And a republic limits and constrains the powers of the rich and its rulers. So we have to give serious thought how to put small r republican limits on the enormous disparities of wealth and power that are corrupting our nation. We will need a small r Republican Party too. My personal hope is that as a people, we Americans will meet this historical challenge facing us, and the Democratic Republic will emerge not just restored to its past glory, but as something freer, fairer, and more just. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, the floor is open for questions. The gentleman on the side there.
I wasn't trying to be quick on the draw, sorry. So, actually, on the grimness thing, you recently wrote something comparing Trump to a different set of categories than fascism, which is tyranny.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, if you look at the Trump regime, a lot of the fascist parallels are intentional because
Yeah.
they're fanboying it.
Yeah.
But the sort of incompetence and herky-jerkiness of it also has stuff that's not in common with historical fascist regimes. And I think that the central figure of the Trump regime is, maybe this is controversial, Trump,
Yes.
who doesn't have any ideas
Yeah.
and is out of Plato's Republic, Book 9, or
Yeah.
whatever, right? And the thing about fascism is it gets defeated in our historical imaginary, but from without.
Yeah.
Whereas tyranny, that's something we can fight against. And so I wonder, like, is the grimness thing altogether necessary? Because fascism sounds like a fate, but when I hear about a tyrant, I get angry.
Yeah, it's an excellent series of points. I mean, I think there's something to it. I do think that obviously Hitler and Mussolini, although there was a lot of contradictions and incoherences in their doctrine, when they spoke, there was something like ideas, and that's not the case. Trump is extremely taken with his own petty grievances in a way. And yeah, I thought that too. I was kind of going through a little classics period, and I thought, oh, this guy's a petty tyrant from the classics. So I think that that's an instructive parallel. The one thing I would warn about is that I think the image of fascism is they really have their shit together, right? That's part of the propaganda image, and that's part of the propaganda spectacle that the Trump people are spreading, which to anybody who reads a real newspaper knows it's not the case. But I think that, as Neumann pointed out, and as the contemporary observers of Italian fascism point out, and the road from Italian fascism from its kind of quasi-constitutional period to the dictatorship, is what those situations were also kind of a mess. And there were grave errors made by political elites and mass politics too, that allowed that to happen and give the sense of fate. It's true that the sense of fate, the sense of historical inevitability, is a piece of fascist propaganda. And I don't want to echo that. I go back and forth. I think it's important to talk about the parallels, but yeah, as I said, I don't want to frighten people or think it's an inevitability. But I would look at the actual history of those regimes, and they are kind of a mess. And also, I hate to tell you, a lot of people that Stalin elevated were pretty fucking stupid, and they managed to keep something together. So, I would say, I think it was Napoleon who said stupidity is not an obstacle in politics. So, stupidity creates probably more problems than if they were super competent, but it's not a panacea that's going to get us out of it, is what I would say to that, yeah. I can close this.
I'll stand up so I'm not talking in people's ears. Hi. Thank you so much for your writing, especially over the last 2 years. It's been a wonderful touch point in a very chaotic time. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice to hear.
Yes, of course. I'm a big fan of Hannah Arendt. I studied her a fair amount in college a couple of years ago. So was very excited when I heard you say her name. One thing that I read in an interview that she had, I believe with the New Yorker, I'm not sure, after she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem,
Right.
was basically someone asked, what kind of pushback did you get about this?
Oh.
And she said a lot of criticism about my tone, basically.
Yeah.
Like, I don't disagree with what you're saying. You're not wrong, but the way you're saying it is just so. And it was from, like, people who think themselves intellectuals, or very.
Yeah.
I basically wanted to know if there is a difference between that kind of pushback and the kind of pushback that you get from opponents of criticizing your rhetoric or the inflammatory nature of it. Is there a difference in your opinion?
I would not compare what I've experienced to what Hannah Arendt experienced after Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was really, we might call it today cancellation. She really had a very hard time, and people were vicious. And she received hate mail, and friendships were broken, and people really went after her. And yes, part of it was the ironical tone she adopted, which I admire and think is great rhetoric and beautiful writing. And I think that this doesn't diminish my respect for her in any way. I think there was point at which there was a little emotional self-protection in that style. But no, I mean, look, I've dealt with a handful of annoying people, and they've gotten a little nasty sometimes. I've suspected in my paranoid moments that they may be conspiring, but I really don't think so. I have to say it's been a lot of fun, and you know, a lot of wonderful people have not exactly, you know, I didn't need everybody to agree with me. It was just nice to have a real debate and discussion. And the people who actually engaged with me, even when they disagreed, I really appreciated it, including Dylan Riley, who I think I've persuaded a little bit. But he was originally someone who I actually criticized his writing, but I still admired it. And he was very generous with his time and with, you know, saying, oh, that's a take I hadn't considered. So I think that that's the difference. Like, my constant gripe was like, this is not really a debate, because a lot of people refuse to debate. So yeah, I was frustrated. But ultimately, it was still, you know, it kept me going. It gave me something to write about, and I had a lot of fun with it. I don't think that it really... Do I regret the tone of which I expressed myself at any point in it? No. I think I gave as good as I got. Yeah.
To be fair, I think her tone was fine as well.
Okay,
like,
thank you. I appreciate that. That's what I want to hear.
A huge fan of your writing.
Oh, thank you so much.
But
Yes.
Okay.
The gentleman there. Yes.
But he was in the middle of complimenting me.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were talking to someone.
Okay.
I'm a big fan. I'm a huge fan of your book, so it's just huge. I was just wondering... Oh, sure.
Oh, hi.
Hello. I was just wondering, you mentioned it can't happen here earlier on, and there's obviously a parallel between Mussolini and Hitler, the difference being that they were the kind of the culmination of things, whereas in It Can't Happen Here, the Trumpist character, the Buzz Windrup president, is just the beginning.
Yeah.
And after him, there's worse. So I guess my question is, do you fear that Trump is the beginning, not the end, and the Vance regime and the Stephen Miller regime is what we're going to be talking about?
That's a worst case scenario that we get a kind of Russia-Turkey situation where they have a ruling party that works. But I got to tell you, and maybe this is wishful thinking, as weird as it sounds, I think a lot of it relies on the charismatic leadership of Trump. And his contradictory, thoughtless, having no ideas makes it all work. You know, if anybody acts actual ideas, they're going to piss off other members of the coalition. And what he does by being totally mushy is every member of the coalition can look at him and believe that they're reflected in him. So, I don't want to... Another thing to think about, another parallel, which is not a perfect parallel, but an interesting one, with fascist movements in the present is like, these were fractious movements, right? They had groups that had different interests and often really incoherent ones, and they're always pushing the leader for their program. And then you have a lot of people, like there was writing of early fascist journalists where they would almost openly threaten Mussolini with a coup, and they did in private too. And you kind of see that happen on like social media or in podcasts where they start to beat their chests really hard and we're like, I'm disappointed with Trump, he's not good enough. And then another day he says something and they're back on side and they say, oh, he's the greatest leader, da, da. So you see a similar process. As far as the long term, I don't know. It's very difficult to predict. I just can't imagine that. I mean, I think the theorists of competitive authoritarianism are very smart, and the idea that they would raise the price of opposition to being very uncomfortable and make it not that easy to do politics, that seems really plausible to me. But one-party totalitarian state under J.D. Vance, don't see it happening. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how to ask this question properly. So there's what needs to happen with civil society now, with ICE agents, Supreme Court, law, voting, all of those pieces. But I really agree with the thesis that there's a kind of much broader delegitimization of the Democratic Party, which I think flows a little bit from they're a big tent party and they have a lot of different coalitions to keep together. Looking kind of more broadly past the current moment, what does the opposition party have to do to secure actual legitimacy in this kind of situation?
I don't think it's really that hard, honestly. I think that, I mean, and this might sound naive in a certain way, but I think they really dealt themselves a series of body blows over the past decade by the jerky way that they did primaries. You know, say what you like about the Republican Party, and a horrible person took over, but they had a primary, and then they abided by the leadership that took it over. I mean, they got scared shitless by it, too. But, you know, that's part of democratic politics, too. So I really think that the leadership of the party needs to shift, and they really need... I think that Kamala Harris, or whoever the Democratic Party nominee would have been in 2024, had a much better chance of winning if they had actual primary, because it would have done two things. It would have created a sense of, you know, legitimacy, democratic excitement about the party, and it would have taken all of the media attention away from Trump. Who's going to be the Democratic leader? Who's going to be the Democratic leader? That's an interesting story. Maybe more interesting than Trump, who, you got to remember, at the beginning of his campaign, it looked a little bit like he was out of gas. So I think that, you know, my hope, and maybe it's too late, I don't know, but my hope is that, yeah, they really just need to have a real primary that is covered rigorously by journalists, and has candidates with interesting and different positions, and it'll attract excitement. I mean, look, do you guys remember? I mean, Obama was not the handpicked choice of the party. He won a primary fair and square. You know, he beat the establishment. He wasn't, and in retrospect, he is the establishment, but that's because he won. So, in that moment, and he was obviously, it was an extraordinarily exciting moment, historical. He was a very charismatic individual, but the momentum he built in that primary campaign created the sense of inevitability that went into his campaign. It's the same thing as Trump. So that is important. I just think that that's a part of I mean, you could say it's a spectacle, fine, I don't know. It's a part of modern democracy. And we don't live in an era, I mean, it would be nice, trust me. I have indulged in this fantasy as well. I wish there were somebody out there, some elite, who knew what they were doing. But that's not the way it works. There has to be, and people get pissed off at that pretension, as we've seen. So there has to be some infusion of democratic energy into the Democratic Party. And I honestly believe, this debates about rhetoric and policy aside, those will be sorted out in the process. That would make a huge difference. I don't think that that's negligible. Yeah.
Someone besides another white male. I'm still woke.
Yes, we're still woke.
Thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you.
I would like to ask you about global spread of fascism.
Yeah.
And I believe that fascism is not only current in the U.S., but also around the world. And for instance, I'm from Tokyo, Japan, and Japan going to have a new president. Actually, it's our first female president in Japan. And that sounds good at a glance, but actually she's really conservative and far right. And so I feel like some of her argument or rhetoric is very similar to President Trump. For example, illegal immigrants or family value, those kind of stuff. So I would like to ask you about like your opinion about like ripple effect or global spread of fascism from the U.S. And I'm sure this does not happen in my country, like a lot of countries around the world. So I would like to ask you about that.
It's a difficult question to answer. I don't know very much about Japanese politics. I understand that the same party has ruled for a very long time. I don't, just speaking about the world in general, there does seem to be the fact that these far right movements are on the rise in a lot of places, and I would not discount the fact that they have friendly oligarchs to put their fingers on the scale of the media. This is difficult to fight, and to some people, they throw their hands up and say it creates impossible obstacles. I don't know if that's true. I think that, different forms of effective organization are going to be different in different places. I think that the problem is that for most of the place, the center-left parties have really not stood for much. And they did that, as somebody mentioned, maybe to try to keep a big tent. But I think their formulas and their ideas and their rhetoric is stale, and it's going to need revision. And I think a lot of the debates about that. Okay, this is a big frustration of mine. I think a lot of the debates about what a Democratic candidate should say, or any opposition candidate should say, or what policy suite they should adopt is kind of missing the point. I think that they're not thinking that there is probably a way to reconsolidate the big tent with a different set of ideas and rhetoric that doesn't sound like yesterday's news and like something that people are already fed up with. So, I've been thinking a lot about Lincoln, and Lincoln had an immense talent of being, on the one hand, an extremely principled person, on the other hand, an extremely canny politician. And basically, he was able to adopt a rhetoric, which people were very comfortable with, about, the Declaration and the Constitution, and suit it to his needs of anti-slavery politics. And now anti-slavery politics are not abolitionism. There was a big difference, and the abolitionists did not care for Lincoln. They thought he was a squish, and he wasn't going to do it. But he, if you look, he managed to hold on to this principle throughout his debates, throughout his campaigning. He didn't always win. So I think there is a way in which a new approach to politics that is both, this may sound so abstract as to not make sense, or it's just empty phrases too, but there must be some way to look like you appear to be principled, but you don't seem fanatical and rigid and dogmatic. And, I hope that there's somebody out there that can speak that way. It's kind of what you have to do. So I think standing up for principles, but standing up for those principles in a language that people find appealing, that is not alienating and they understand, is going to be a big part of whatever opposition to this appears in the world. So good rhetoric is important. Adelaide. Okay.
Thank you for presenting. I wanted to ask, kind of in the vein of opposition, at one point you said that the best remedy for the ills of democracy is more democracy.
Yeah.
And...
Well, I didn't say it. John Dewey said it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm from California, for context, so we had our gerrymandering movement, I guess. And I think what scares me about that, while I see the kind of pragmatic appeal politically, is that I'm scared of this anti-democratic tit for tat, essentially, which I think I just feel like rather than this kind of rational opposition that you just I guess suggested, that we are kind of degrading our politics overall. And I wonder if you have any opinion or suggestion as to how you see us being able to avoid that.
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem. Okay, so, I think is he a political theorist or sociologist? One of those things. Juan Linz, talks about how the use of, kind of anti-democratic methods to deal with an anti-democratic opponent creates a vicious cycle and legitimates the other side. And, you know, you hear that a lot from people who are kind of in the center right to center left, and I think it's more wise than maybe people on the left have given it credit. And maybe I was mistaken, but I was a big proponent of throwing Trump in jail because I thought that, and that had a kind of Machiavellian approach to this, which was like, as a political class, if they couldn't protect themselves and get rid of this guy, they're useless. And they had to be kind of ruthless about that. And the kind of the half doing it and then not doing it, it just made, and they're like, well, we're being fair, but you are prosecuting. Like, if you're going to do it, do it. So, and I think that they definitely think that. So I think that, you know, there's a certain extent to which these kind of half-baked measures, which look legitimate, but to appear to a lot of people to be, you know, abuses, are kind of, again, the worst of all possible worlds. In retrospect, I wrote something that was, you know, furiously in favor of throwing the book at Trump, and that they should come down harder. I mean, you know, but I think actually that the problem is that there's like, you know, politics happens over time, and there are public opinion changes, and they miss the opportunity, and this has happened, and I'm sorry to say, this happens a lot in the history of rise of fascism regimes. There was kind of a minute when you have to strike where the iron is hot. And the crisis for Trump was the direct aftermath of January 6th, where he was kind of at low ebb of support, and we have the Republicans to thank for not totally breaking ranks on that one and impeaching and convicting him. So, yeah, it's you know, all these things are subject to public opinion, and you have to be very canny about when you're applying those things in such a way that they look legitimate and they don't appear to other people to be abuses, and they don't excuse and allow further abuses. I don't have the answer to it. I mean, obviously, we're a nation of laws. You have to enforce the laws. But obviously, there are norms around, you know, what we don't do to people who are political opposition, which infringes upon speech. We're starting to get into those problems. So I don't really have an answer in principle to that. I think that those are prudential questions, which a smart politician would, you know, have a response to in the moment, and then in the future, people would say, they pushed it a little there, but in the end, they did the right thing because, like, it needed to happen. I mean, again, you see this with FDR, you see this with Lincoln, it happens. So in principle, I don't know. I would say the people who say always be cautious, never, you know, take aggressive steps, I don't think that's a principle, and obviously it can't be a principle to always be maximally aggressive. It's a matter of judgment, and that's a very difficult thing, and perhaps we have a lack of talent, but great politicians exercise that kind of judgment and understand the situations they're in. So I'm sorry, it's kind of a non-answer, but yeah.
Gentleman in the back has been waiting the longest.
Naomi Klein wrote an article in The Guardian in April, identifying what she called end times fascism.
Yeah.
And my question has to do with the role of fundamentalisms, fundamentalizing, and how you would see that, whether it's Christian or market or all of its other forms.
Yeah.
That's the question.
Well, I mean, you know, I will say about Christian fundamentalism, although there was kind of a renewal about, or a revival after the Charlie Kirk assassination, I think a marked and interesting thing about the Trump phenomenon is how secular it is. It appeals to a lot of people who are right-wing but secular. So it's kind of and a lot of people on the right talk about it as the post-Christian right. So I don't know, and I think that the idea that religious fundamentalism was the real problem in the world, and that we had to throw back the forces of ignorance, and I mean, I just think secularism can be just as dangerous. It's again, I don't think it's another thing where I don't think you can say in principle that one thing, you have people who are extremely people of deep religious convictions that have ideas that I find to be very appealing and would put their lives on the line for it. I mean, so I don't know. I would say, in terms of market fundamentalism, I don't know. The thing about these modern movements is that they're willing to kind of move away from market fundamentalism, which kind of gives them some strength. Now, they usually work to benefit the extremely rich, but, you know, the old paradigm where Milton Friedman and those guys were the guiding lights is over. So, and you could say there is no, I mean, it's very haphazard. There is no doctrine guiding it. So I don't know if fundamentalism is exactly how I would discuss any of these issues. Yeah.
Lisa, and then Alex.
Thanks so much for a terrific talk, and I very much appreciated your invocations also of Gramsci and Arendt, etc. I have two questions. The first one is, I noticed that you didn't invoke psychoanalytic theorists.
Oh, yeah.
And it strikes me that this moment, I'm ambivalently related to psychoanalytic thinking, but it strikes me in this moment it's hard to fully avoid thinking through issues like enjoyment in that sense, for example, the pleasure in revenge or the impunity to flout the law. Or so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. And the second question is really about race in this equation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think psychoanalysis is very interesting. I have at times seen a psychoanalyst, but I read things and I find them. I personally find them persuasive when there's psychoanalytic interpretations of political phenomenon. But the fact that I find them so personally persuasive is kind of why I avoid them, because I kind of think that they're a layup, and that they prevent you from thinking about more structural things. Because you're just like, wow, there's something kind of fucked up about them. And you're like, well, okay, it's true. I think that, you know, but I do take it seriously. And I love the Frankfurt School who calls on psychoanalytic theory. But I guess I just try. I try to start, and this is not a judgment of anybody else in the way they think, but the way I kind of think is you start with the most simple and elegant formula you can come up with, and only when that breaks down, you start to add psychological explanations on top of it. So it's like, I just view them as kind of like second order filling in the gaps for when there's like a problem with the theory that you're trying to come up with. Now, I think some people use it in ways that are fascinating, and I have written about the kind of libidinal appeal of all this. I think it's undeniable that there's a libidinal appeal, but there's undeniable there's a lot about gender and sexuality to do with the whole thing. So I think that stuff is all real. But I think as a personal discipline and my own personal kind of aesthetics about writing, I kind of try to avoid it because it almost feels like a cheat code to be like, to kind of armchair psychoanalyze somebody. Because if you know the words, you can kind of do it. But so I prefer not to. But I do admire and read with great interest a lot of people who are into that stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Race.
Oh, race. Well, you know, I don't think there's. This is a tough one as well. I don't think there's any doubt that obviously that there's a strong racist core to Trump's appeal, and that a racially purified America is a big part of the imagination that animates Trump and his supporters. But America is by fact, a multiracial place. If you look at the ICE officers, they're not all white guys. The process by which, and here's where I think that fascism kind of recommends itself, and maybe not model so much like white supremacy or other things like that, because fascism is highly flexible, and it can accommodate racial ideas, and then under different circumstances kind of step away from them. Mussolini sometimes, well, I mean, partially this was due to his alliance with Hitler, but he didn't start as a racial, as a biological racist. He was sort of a cultural Italian supremacist. And then he has a lot of rhetoric, and sometimes he talks about race, and sometimes he says race is not a real thing. So I think that there's a lot of juggling that goes on, and there's an old American right-wing tradition of like colorblind racism, which is still being used by Republicans today, which is trying to like pretend that there is a civic nationalism that they're upholding, which is non-racial and colorblind. It's very hard for them to credibly say that now, I think. I think that most people are kind of onto them, or not, unfortunately not most people. A lot of people are onto them. So I think that those appeals are weirdly mixed with really overt racist appeals. That's been the case for a while, but they're definitely like, I would say the colorblind stuff was at the forefront, the overt racial appeals were in the background, and now those things have changed places. Then the colorblind civic nationalist SOP has a role to play, but it's not as, I think they don't think, and I don't think that their audiences think it's as emotionally powerful as the stuff that plays around with race. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I'll let you step past here, yeah. Really quickly, very big fan. Have read you for a long time. The stuff about the Dreyfus Affair, all that, the proto-fascism, I've always thought was very insightful. The fanboy comment from earlier, I think you mentioned something about how they're fanboying fascism. It reminded me of something I've seen that I took as almost a silver lining that a lot of the propaganda, I guess you'd say, from Trumpism seems to, the way I saw it described was like cargo cult fascism. They're gesturing towards 20th century fascism, or even just like the movie Sicario or memes that they've seen on 4chan and things like that. And I took that as a little bit of a silver lining, as well, if these guys are so thoughtless that all they can do is gesture at what they've seen in media, maybe they're not as organized and dangerous as I might fear them to be. But I was curious, in your own reading and thinking about earlier fascism or other reactionary authoritarian movements, is that unique to these guys, or is that just a common, very common part of this sort of politics?
It's all spectacle. I mean, the whole thing was spectacle. It was all about projecting this idea of force and power, and all the marching guys and all the speeches and the flags and like all of that was the spectacle. It was a spectacle that in historical retrospect is very terrifying because of what it represents, but it was definitely to impress the idea of power on people, and it did. It worked. I think it takes a lot of, you got to not be impressed by the spectacle. I think my friend Jamel Bowie had a very smart take on it, which was just like, they're creating a kind of simulacrum of fascism, of a totalitarian state that's kind of for them. But I don't think that is so much a good thing to lean on, because it shows what they want very clearly, speaking psychoanalytically. And I don't think they were necessarily going to be happy with, I was going to say something vulgar, but I'm not going to say it. I don't think they're necessarily going to be happy with the mere appearances. I think that a lot of their most radical followers who egg them on social media really want the real thing. So, that being said, a part of me believes, you also have to look at this from internally. Like, we look at this stuff and we see all these transparent lies, we see all this ridiculous propaganda, we see all these absurd fantasies. The fact of the matter is that we're talking about people, a lot of people, who really believe this. They are stuck in their own media world. So when they're like, I never heard of Tren de Aragua, but this is something that's like really was in Fox Media and stuff like that, all these gangs and stuff. This whole world of enemies and bad guys and things. This is their world, and they are a little bit navel gazing is the wrong word, but they are definitely like in a separate universe of discourse and imagination that's kind of shocking. But you have to remember that some of them take it deadly seriously, and and it's those people, I think, who might be satisfied with the theater of it. So they still think, like with the troops coming here, which is terrible. They still think it's 2020. Like, they still think the George Floyd protests are going on. And some of it is regret for not having done this earlier. So they're trying to, there's no insurrection. There's no actual violence, I mean, on a grand scale. They're trying to make up for lost time. Now, in the actual fascist history and the classical fascist examples, especially in Italy, there was an enormous amount of actual violence and disorder. A lot of it was fomented by the fascists, but there were strikes. There were mass strikes. There were socialists who were armed. Socialists, the reason why the landlords got the fascist gangs is because they were scared of their workers. It wasn't all imaginary. There was real stuff going on. And there were militias in Weimar Germany. Interestingly enough, considering how crazy the Nazis turned out to be, they were much less violent in their coming to power than the Italian fascists, who really exulted in that. Look, and that's another criticism that people have of the fascism thesis that I think is smart, which is like, look, the state of civil disorder is not comparable. But two things to that is a lot of them think it is, and a lot of politics has moved from the street online, which is sort of what I'm saying. So a lot of the mobbing, harassment, which has real world effects, is horrible, happens on the internet. So that's just, the material conditions have changed.
I'm really sorry. We are out of time.
I'm having so much fun.
I know, but you're going to run out of that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.